standards in Scotland as a pilot. For now, we're joined by Kieran Hannigan. Kieran is head of scripted Screen Scotland. Many of you will hopefully know Kieran. Julia Brown, diversity standards manager at BFI, is joining us on two rather big screens, Julia. And Jenna Cunningham, awards manager at BAFTA Scotland. So we've got plenty to talk about. The format, Kieran will do a brief introduction, 5 minutes or so. We'll hand over to Julia for, I think, around 20 minutes. And we'll let Jen introduce herself as well. And then we'll move on to some questions. We have a few already, and I'm sure you will have some to add to. We may or may not run to the full hour. We'll see how we go. So, first off, Kieran, to introduce a bit about the initiative.
Yeah, I mean, I guess from the pieces of work we've done in the past, we know that there isn't equal participation in this industry across all sectors of society, and that's clearly something that's a concern and something we want to tackle. And I think more broadly, in terms of the kind of stories we want to see on screen, we want to see stories that reflect the full range of stories in the world and the full range of experiences people have. And I think when we don't reflect those, our kind of library of stories are all the poorer for it. So from a basic standpoint, that's why we were interested in approaching it. I guess why these standards in particular. The BFI, as I understand it, has been running these since 2016. They're really well established. They're market tested, they work well. We know they're kind of compliant with the necessary legislation, the 2010 Equality Act. And we also know they've become the industry standard. So they've been adopted by Film 4, clearly the BFI, BBC Films, and indeed BAFTA. And the BFI offered us, or enabled us to look at localizing the standards, because we know the needs are different across different parts of the UK. So what you see presented on the website and the guidelines are kind of reflective of the needs of Scotland specifically. And I guess there's kind of two other things I would say. The first is, it's not about a form, and that's really important. The form is a record. It's a record of thought processes and decisions and actions you take and actions you plan. The key thing, the reason for introducing them, is to open up those conversations, to make people think about the choices that they're making, the hires that they make, the way that stories are told. And yes, there is a form because what gets measured gets done. We want to make sure that people do what they say they'll do. And we also want to gather our understanding of the industry and gather our understanding of representation. But I think it's really important that this is about the thought process, and this is about the actions that people take rather than the form itself. And the final thing is, as Alistair says, this is a pilot for 1 year. We know these standards have been implemented successfully elsewhere in the UK. We've every confidence that they will be implemented successfully here, but it is a pilot. So, we will have our ears open. We'll welcome informal feedback about how it goes, but we'll also be undertaking a rigorous evaluation at the end of 12 months to see if anything needs to change, and to see what worked well, and so on. So that's the kind of basics. That's why we're here today. And for much more information, if it's okay, I'll hand over to you, Julia.
Thank you.
Hi.
Julia, we just heard that BFI have been working with the standards since 2016, and we just published the guidelines yesterday. So help us bridge that gap and tell us a bit about the mechanics of the standards, how they work.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk basically practically about how the standards work. I'm the diversity standards manager at the BFI, so I look after the day-to-day sort of assessment of the standards. And like I said, I'm going to talk about how the criteria actually works. There's quite a lot of information, so if there's any questions, please feel free to ask at the end or get in touch with me. So, what are the standards? A very broad question. They're a framework to tackle underrepresentation, aiming to encourage everyone across the film and TV industry to make meaningful changes to their projects to become more inclusive. A question we get a lot is, because we talk about underrepresented groups throughout the criteria, is what are the underrepresented groups? A good place to start if you're not sure what we're talking about there is the protected characteristics from the Equality Act 2010, which you can see here. In addition to that, sorry, there's just a slight delay on the slide, so sorry for the slight pauses. In addition to that, we recognise there are specific barriers faced by underrepresented groups in the screen sectors in Scotland. So we're also looking at these groups below to bring it in line with Scottish legislation and to make projects more representative of the Scottish population. Obviously, some of these groups referenced on both these slides apply differently on screen versus off screen. And, you know, we might use slightly different language when we're practically talking about some of them. But the protected characteristics and these groups here are the best place to start if you're wondering what do we mean by underrepresented. So passing the standards. So to comply with the diversity standards, projects are required to pass 2 of the 4 categories, and that's standards A to D. Standard C, which is about career progression and sort of early career development, is compulsory for all projects aside from development stage applications. Typically, development applications, they're only required to meet 1 standard, and typically that's standard A. Like it says here, concessions are made for small teams. What we're talking about when we say small team is typically less than 25. I'll talk a little bit more about that when we reach the relevant criteria, but generally speaking, we consider a small team less than 25. So this is the criteria for standard A, on-screen representation, themes and narrative. I'm going to go through this in detail, just talking about what it practically means, mainly from the angle of development and production applications. This does apply to festivals as well, and I actually did a talk yesterday. There was about audience-facing projects. So this does apply to that, but I'm going to talk about it mostly for development and production today. So if you've got any questions specifically about festivals, please feel free to ask at the end. So this A1 is about the lead characters, contributors and voice artists. With all the criteria in this section, I'm going to break down into basically what are the questions we're actually trying to get at. So for this, it's who are the lead characters? What representation are they bringing? Are they a complex character going beyond stereotypes? And have we seen this character before? Is kind of all the questions that we're asking and looking for you to answer in your applications. So A2 is about sort of all the characters overall. You can see that the targets here are, these are the ones I was talking about, sort of to bring it in line with the Scottish population and Scottish legislation. So if you meet any one of these targets, then you can meet the criteria in A2. But beyond just the targets, when we're talking about characters, we're also looking for how are these characters represented, and are you going beyond stereotypes and tropes? So, you know, actually filling in an application, you'd be saying which target you're meeting and who are these characters. So A3 is about the main story and subject matter. So who is this story about? Is it a complex representation of a person or subject matter? Is it maybe a fresh take on a genre, narrative, or a specific story that brings new representation? and what is a perspective, not just in terms of the character perspective, but who are the filmmakers and why are they telling this story. This is about the other storylines and subject matter. So this could be what representation do the subplots bring, or what representation does a narrative of a secondary character bring? Okay, so setting, there's a couple of different angles for this. So in terms of a real world setting, both for Scotland and the rest of the UK, do we see this location a lot? Are you portraying it in a non-stereotypical way? Specifically for Scotland, there's some definitions of like underrepresented of Scotland, which I'll talk about in a moment on the next slide. For non-UK settings, do we see this country or city a lot? An example would be New York. And what perspective are you offering on this place? In the sense of, is it a tourist eye view? And is that really underrepresented? For a fictional setting, and with that I mean something that's, you know, fantasy or science fiction, what does it represent about the real world? And it could also be a specific community that exists, you know, in a geographic place or multiple places, and that might be something like a religious, immigrant, specific socioeconomic community. We would also consider that underrepresented. So as you can see here, there's this specific definition of what we're talking about for regional participation, underrepresented areas of Scotland, and this applies both in terms of setting and also later on when we're talking about workforce and opportunities and audience development. This also applies there. A6 is about casting. So this could either be authentic casting, you know, are you actually casting a person of that ethnicity or community? For roles where there's a disabled character, have you cast a disabled actor? There's also non-specific casting, by which I mean, you know, did a casting choice you made bring additional representation in the film as opposed to the character as written? We would also be looking at for, you know, what is your overall casting plan? What languages are you using when roles are sent out? Are venues for casting accessible? And are you doing things like street casting or casting in specific communities to sort of bring those opportunities and authenticity to the casting? So B, standard B is about the crew and the project team. So B1 and B2 are about having specific numbers of people in roles. So B1 is about the department heads. So it's at least 3 of the following roles are held by people from underrepresented groups. Like it says there, if there are additional roles on your film not mentioned above, but they're, you know, essential to basically at that same level. So on a VFX heavy production, you might consider the VFX lead. If it's animation, obviously there are additional roles, and for things like you know, audience facing activity, there are other additional roles. Anything that's kind of on that level, you would just include those. B2 is about other key roles, so at least 6 other key roles. So that's sort of mid-level technical positions are filled by somebody from an underrepresented group. And as you can see there, for both of those, this is one of the areas where we would make allowances for smaller crews. So basically, when you're filling in an application, you just let us know that you believe you had a small crew. And instead of, you know, the 3 or 6 that it requires, we would potentially let you, you know, pass with maybe 2 in B1 or 1 or 4 in B2, depending on the size of your crew. So we very much take into account the size of your crew when it's, you know, these criteria where there's specific numbers applied. So this B3 is about the overall crew and meeting, you know, one of those targets that you saw before that's the same both for on-screen and for this. One thing I would say, obviously, if you want to, you know, say whether or not you meet this criteria, it's important to ensure that you're doing a quality monitoring for your crew. You know, if that's not something you're already doing, that's maybe something to work on. And obviously ourselves and Screen Scotland can help you with that. But it's something to consider, not just for, you know, meeting this criteria, but to have an idea of, you know, who's in the industry, who's in the crew overall. But yeah, to meet this criteria, there would need to be some sort of equality monitoring component, so you could say whether or not you met this overall. And then B4 is about sort of work in underrepresented regions. Again, that Scottish specific definition here. We're talking about things like using local crew when filming on location, using facilities in these areas, specific craft people in these areas, all things like that. Another thing to mention is across all of the criteria in B and C, you can meet criteria with specific interventions made for primary caregivers. So that could be things like job share opportunities, childcare, and flexible working arrangements. So this, if that applies across, the whole crew, or in regards to specific crew, you can mention that anywhere across B and C. So standard C is about sort of early career development and opportunities. This is compulsory for everything but development, like I said, because obviously with development, we're not expecting you to, be in a position to do these opportunities yet. One thing to mention as well, again, we very much take into account the size of the crew or the project team when it comes to how many of these apply and how they apply. So C1 is paid employment opportunities. So your project is offering paid employment opportunities, apprenticeships, internships, expert advisors. Expert advisors could be, somebody who's an expert on a specific historical period, a specific community, or something technical like a craft or dance, things like that. You might be using specific organizations to place candidates from underrepresented groups if you don't actually have people in place yet. So that's where you would mention that. That's where we want to see, this isn't just filling in the form. It's about what your plan is in order to do all these things. Like, have you thought about which organizations you'll use? And again, that's something where if you say, I want to have these internships, apprenticeships, but I don't know who to go to, obviously, sort of the BFI Screen Scotland can help you point towards those organisations if you're not sure who to go to. C2, training opportunities and skills development. So that can be, and also including sort of one-off and student work experiences opportunities. So as well as it can also be training opportunities for existing crew. Again, this is somewhere where you might be using specific organisations to place people. It's something where we again take into account sort of what the size of the project is in terms of what you're allowed to offer. If you're not able to offer sort of wide work experience opportunities, internships, but you are able to do a one-off training or seminar or presentation for, let's say, a local school on location, that could potentially meet the criteria here. C3 is promotion to a role that constitutes career progression. So crew from an underrepresented group are given a role that constitutes career progression. This might be a step up from previous roles, so from their previous credits, or over the course of a production, or it could be, for example, someone moving from shorts to features, something like that. C4 is first job roles. So it could be, this might be their first job after education. They might be moving from a different industry, but yeah, it's about it being their first sort of full non-trainee role. C5 is about meaningful structured mentoring programs. So that could either be run as part of the project over the course of this specific project, or something that the production company runs. It could be a wider mentorship program sort of in the industry where a HOD is part of that, and their mentees sort of get involved with the project. But it's really about it being a structured, formal mentoring program, whether that's something specific to the project, to your production company, or part of a wider industry thing. Again, like I said, specific interventions made for primary caregivers apply here. And we do make allowances for smaller teams, like I said. So again, there's no like specific number of trainees that you have to have for any of these, but we very much look at the size of the crew, the budget, and what you're able to offer within that in terms of the type of opportunities. So standard D is about audience development. It only applies for production applications where there's a distributor on board at the point that you're applying initially for funding, let's say. So it's rarely filled in at the initial application stage, but potentially once the project is complete, so when you come to like delivery, you might want to fill in some information here if there is a distributor on board and these are discussions that you've had. So in terms of the criteria, D1 is about disability access and materials. So access interventions that go beyond delivery requirements. So a real commitment to making a release, festival, or program as accessible to as wide an audience as possible. So this is in terms of both online and in-person screenings, captions, sign language, and making sure beyond that, that accessible screenings are actually signposted on relevant websites, not just that they're provided, but also they're signposted on sort of the relevant things like your local cinema, accessible screenings, where people actually can find out about them. D2, underserved audiences. So the target audiences of a project are an underserved audience group with a clear strategy to reach them. So the rest of standard D is basically about once you've identified who those underserved audiences are that you want to reach, actually reaching them. So D3, regional, national audiences and geographical reach in Scotland. So strategies to add value and engage audiences from underserved locations across Scotland. So what are you doing locally, especially outside of centres where there is more provision of sort of film culture? So are you doing grassroots marketing? Are there events, Q&As at different cinemas and discussions with talent? What work are you doing with local venues on a release? Promotional and marketing strategies. So again, this is about reaching that underserved audience that you mentioned in D2. So this can be everything from sort of how and where the film is marketed, any events, how are you doing outreach, what's your online strategies, depending on the subject matter, is the educational content tying in with it? Like, are you doing work with schools or higher education? Is there any app, game, VR type content sitting alongside it, as well as things like pricing strategies? So, you know, pay what you can, pay it forward tickets, with partnerships, which I'll mention in a second. Are you offering specific pricing through partners in order to reach a specific underserved audiences? At D5, the partnerships using specialist or expert knowledge. So this can be everything from, this is the partners that you're using to find and reach those audiences. So this can be everything from, you know, community groups, charities, regional venues. It can be online influencers. It can be, you know, film festivals, programmers. It kind of comes back to, you know, what is the subject matter of the film, and what are those underserved audiences and how are you going about reaching them? So that's basically all of the criteria. Like I said before, C is compulsory for everything but development applications. But otherwise, you need to meet 2 standards of A to D to meet the criteria. In terms of practically how it works, it's quite straightforward. So you're applying for the funding. The applicant fills in the diversity standards application, setting out how they believe they meet the criteria. The certification team, so my team, the diversity standards team, sits within certification at the BFI. We consult with applicants in Screen Scotland to ensure projects meet the standards. So it might be, you know, we have some questions or we're not sure what exactly you mean about something. It's never an immediate no, because again, it very much isn't about just filling in a form and ticking boxes. If we ask you more questions, it's just so we can enable you to go, okay, you know, what exactly is your plan for this? You say that you want to have, you know, sort of, we want to have 5 interns. Okay, well then how are you going to get those interns? Like, what organizations are you going to use? And, you know, what departments are they going to be in? Have you thought about that? It's never just about filling in the form saying, yes, I would like to have these interns. It's about how you're actually going to do that. So if we ask you questions, it's only so we can like help you develop your plan for actually doing what your intention is. So if we have questions, we'll speak to you, we'll speak to Screen Scotland, see if there's areas where we can help you if you're not quite there. But it's mostly about like what your ideas are and your plans for making the projects as inclusive and as representative as possible. Once the assessment is complete, certification confirm the project is eligible for funding and awards, so in terms of BAFTA, British Independent Film Awards. And then once the film is complete, there's a follow-up assessment, basically checking, you know, where you did exactly what you said you were going to do or where you did something different. So it's signed off again at the end. So yeah, that's a very quick tour through what the criteria is, what it actually means, and how the process works.
Thank you, Julie. Hugely helpful, and I'm sure people will have questions, but I'll let Jenna say hello. Perhaps first, and just say where BAFTA Scotland come into all of this.
As Kieran mentioned earlier, BAFTA have been working with BFI on these standards for a long time, and BAFTA Scotland have been working with Screen Scotland since last year on these Scotland-specific standards. And where BAFTA can really help is to sort of raise awareness and engagement within the industry, but also fundamentally and practically to provide a lot of data to help, you know, evolve the standards where needed. It's likely that if you've made anything in Scotland, you're going to come into contact with the BAFTA Scotland entry process, where you'll be asked about the standards. And at that point, we can provide Screen Scotland with a lot of data that they maybe wouldn't have had otherwise, to help identify areas that the standards maybe haven't covered, areas where maybe more training and development might be needed within the industry. And in 2021, we applied the standards to our entry process, also as a pilot, so maybe a pre-pilot to this year's pilot. And we asked entrants in the majority of production categories whether they would meet the standards and for any other relevant information. And this, because it was a pilot, it didn't affect eligibility or anything. This was just sort of voluntary. And we found that 96% of entrants felt they would meet the standards. And also we found that for it not affecting eligibility, entrants really, really engaged with it and did provide us with a lot of additional data that we could then share with Screen Scotland to help them evaluate the standards. As Kieran said, you know, it sort of is ongoing, it's not set, there may be changes. So that's really where BAFTA can come in and help.
Great, thank you. I'm sure people will have questions of you as well, but I've got a few, and we've got about half an hour, so I'll maybe ask respondents to keep it relatively brief at this point. I guess playing devil's advocate a bit, Kieran, you know, we're going to be applying these standards to the development stage of projects, so how can we make sure that they're not stifling the stories that creative teams want to make?
I think if you look at the standards that, so Julie mentioned, most people reach for standard A, which is about the characters, the themes, the plots, the locations, the casting. I mean, there's a wide variety of ways in which to meet it. Yeah. And I was quite struck actually listening to Julia talk about the questions they ask. They strike me as a pretty cracking development tool, you know, in terms of the questions you're asking. You know, are these characters ones we haven't seen before? Is this a new take on a familiar story? Are we seeing a familiar story in an unfamiliar setting? Are we seeing unfamiliar heroes? And frankly, if you're developing familiar stories in a familiar setting with familiar characters, I'm not totally convinced you should be doing that, you know, and I'm not convinced we would be really very interested in funding it. It strikes me as, you know, there's a range of ways of meeting this, and actually it's about, you know, it's about three-dimensional characters. It's about a breadth of storytelling. So actually, it strikes me that it's a really useful tool. And you know, I was thinking last night about some of the productions that have come through recently, and some of the development awards we've made. And I honestly, I can't think off the top of my head, and I didn't do this forensically, but I can't think of ones that wouldn't, you know, that we've wanted to invest in that wouldn't hit these criteria, or wouldn't, with a tweak, meet these criteria, because they're the kinds of things we're looking for anyway. And I think the other thing that's really important, and I've heard Judy speak on this before, is these standards aren't about testing to failure. You know, this is about encouraging change and growth and evolution, and, you know, you don't send in your homework and get an F on it. You know, this is about how can you meet these standards. That's what this is. So I think, you know, there's a will to help people meet the standards, and I think it's important that people understand that as well.
Great. You may have answered in part what I was going to ask Julia, but having this been your day-to-day for a long time, are there any misconceptions that you come across repeatedly? Things that have to be discussed with applicants?
I mean, I think one of the key ones is definitely about having to meet every single criteria, which is obviously an ideal. You know, if you had a project that met every single criteria, that's amazing. But people do think that you have to meet every single one, when, you know, it's only a specific number within each criteria that you have to meet. And again, I think it is in part just what we were talking about there, is people think that, you know, it's about, you know, dictating content, saying it has to be a certain way. It's very much about, you know, helping you develop your thinking. And, you know, I've heard people actually say, you know, this did help me think about, you know, not just in terms of, you know, my crewing up, you know, where am I going to get interns, but in terms of the actual content itself. Like, we were thinking of, you know, why does this character have to be a certain way when it could be a completely different way instead? Like, it never occurred to us to sort of cast that person, or to go with that person as like the secondary character, when actually, and then it actually comes up with something much more interesting. So I think, yeah, it's not about us, it's not about meeting every single criteria, and it's not about just the tick box aspect. It's very much about using it as a tool to develop everything from the content, to thinking about how you're crewing up, to thinking about what the sort of career development opportunities are, as well as when you actually get in the room with a distributor, to actually being able to talk about things like, you know, I would like to push for, you know, accessible screenings, that kind of thing. Like, it's a tool that enables you to do all those kind of things. So yeah, I'd say that is what I would want to get across to people.
Thank you. And Jenna, it was the 2021 awards process that you applied this to. How did it go, and were there any lessons from that, I suppose?
I'd probably echo what Julia said, maybe a slight misconception about having to meet all of the standards. And so we can communicate that with entrants, and I'm sure as people become more familiar with the standards and working with them, that it isn't about meeting every single one for us. And for us, it won't be affecting eligibility immediately. It's more making people familiar with the standards, so that in future they may have to meet one or two or a certain number to be eligible. But other than that, we didn't really run into any issues. People seemed to be, you know, really engaged with it, and also quite happy to provide a lot more information that is relevant to these standards as well.
Good. Okay. Well, I guess a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but I'm really interested in views in the room, so we'll open it up for questions, and I guess your reactions as well. I'm really interested if, you know, the extent to which people feel this is a positive development, or potentially feel some sense of nervousness having seen the detail. So if we could open to questions, and if you feel comfortable, please do identify yourself. There's one hand already.
Hi there, I'm John. I run a production company in Edinburgh. I just had two questions. I know that you guys said you're kind of in your pilot year, so you're quite early right now. So you might not have like statistics coming in, but is there even like anecdotal evidence that it is showing an improvement, and is it at a rate that you're kind of wanting it to improve? And the other question is kind of the standards that you spoke through, they seem to be kind of more project specific. But do you have standards that you apply to kind of your own institutions to make sure that kind of your hiring processes and your kind of projects that you carry out fit kind of what you're ideally wanting to reach?
Who would you like
There we
to
go.
take that?
Just for clarity on the stats to date, that we're introducing from 1st of April of this year. So, and we'll be evaluating the pilot year, and so at that point we'll understand a lot more about whether we've been able to affect change. I guess, Creative Scotland, Screen Scotland, we lack good information around qualities, diversity and inclusion, and this is one way that we hope in part to generate that information for future policy intervention. But I don't know if others want to come in, but certainly Julia will have a view on what's working and whether there's evidence for that as well, from a UK perspective.
Yeah, so in terms of like how the diversity standards are working, we've done both kind of a yearly report in terms of our statistics as well as a review of the diversity standards. So that's looking at, you know, not just the sort of stats on a yearly basis or from a certain year to a certain point, but also how they work overall. So that's something we did in the last year, and that's we'll also be looking at as part of that. In terms of the criteria themselves, is there additional work we can do to make them actually more effective? So yeah, there is stats out there in terms of the BFI and in terms of the standards themselves. And in terms of like how we apply to our organisation. So for instance, the BFI has targets not just for who we fund, but in terms of as an employer. So yes, we have those things.
Anyone else want to come in, or will I think I can in part answer the second part of your question, at least from a Screen Scotland and Creative Scotland perspective. We have a Qualities, Diversity and Inclusion team. We have a range of initiatives that are external to the organisation that you might be aware of. Initiatives like Radical Childcare and Radical Care. We an internal perspective, we're held to the Qualities Act that Julia showed those dimensions of, and increasingly we're working to some of the Scottish elements that are there around care experienced young people, for example, refugees, asylum seekers. All of these elements we're starting to push through all of our work as well, and our reporting of that is done through equalities monitoring every 2 years. So, yeah, there's definitely an internal aspect of this for us. Anyone else?
Yeah, thank you so much for this talk. My name is Barbara, and I came down from London. And I'm also part of a kind of a, let's say, disabled community, you know, I can say this word. And I'm also finding that if you want to have more talent that represents those different groups, what would be useful that, for instance, people who are in exec roles are people representing those communities. So they're more likely also to understand and choose or fund projects like that. So that's just my comment, really.
anybody want to come in other than agreement? I think there is an aspect within the standards, Julie, that's specific to non-central roles. Is that right?
So actually, in terms of like, did I understand correctly in terms of like exec roles, the person was asking about there?
I mean, I just want to know like whether you're planning in the future to have people who actually select and look through applications from those communities.
Yeah, I mean certainly on the film side. Just before Christmas, we produced a paper around some of the changes that we want to make, and that's a key bit of it is looking at how we select. And at the moment we select with people who are internal to the organisation, and I think I agree with you. I think there's a strong case for bringing more voices into that room, and that's something we intend to do this year. Yeah, absolutely.
Hi, I'm Zoe Hunter. I suppose a question and a comment. Maybe start with the comment and the question. So I work in both theatre and film, and I'm a parent to two very small children. My experience recently with the work that I've been offered as an actress, I've had to turn most of it down because it cost me more to pay somebody to look after my child than it is for my fee. And I've had several experiences of people, that companies who want to hire me, then going to Creative Scotland, asking for access care costs to maybe not cover the whole thing, but at least to go towards it, and being unable to get that fund because they've had their project funding some time before, and then they later want to hire me as an actress. And so I'm also on the Equity Scottish Committee, and I'm bringing it as a motion to go to the ARC to lobby all funding bodies about just raising this question, because I think it applies to all transitory projects, film, short film, theatre projects, festival curation. The list is endless. You will know your core team when you apply for your original funding, but as you get closer to the project, you start, let's say, crewing up, generally speaking. So for an R&D for a theatre project, you might be getting your cast on board at a later date than when you first put your application in. And so my question is about flexibility and accessibility of access funds. So to suggest to the industries generally that you create a situation where those who are putting in projects can have an easy access point at any point in the process to say, I want to hire that person because of their skill set. They're great. Oh, they have an access need. They have a disability. They need to look after an aged parent, or they have very small children, and they need a little bit of support. And then rather than having to do a great long application process or preclude that person from being able to come on board and be part of that team, you just have to do a really simple phone call or a really simple form, whatever it is, to say they just need a little bit of this to be able to hire that person. And so that you make an entire cultural shift where you stop making worthy projects and, oh, this is a disabled project, we're hiring people who are parents project. You just make good work, and if the people have the skill set and they happen to have needs, then the ability to be able to support them is made easy. Anyway, sorry, that wasn't really a question, it's more an offering. But it would make a world of difference for a lot of people.
Then want to respond to that? I mean, I could absolutely see how that would be a barrier, and that it doesn't just apply to screen projects. So it's something we'll take away. But it's really about when you are able to come in and through a project for those access costs, as opposed to that upfront. So.
And
when you're crewing up and all of the people surrounding the people that you hire in very late in the day for film. You know, some people you're hiring a week before.
Yeah.
And if you're in a short film with an indie budget, your head is not going to be able to get around trying to budget somebody's access needs at that point.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Sarah.
I've got a question for Jenna. I guess because you're a year through your pilot.
Yeah.
Did you become aware of any particular challenges, or did anybody who, you know, filled in your form specifically tell you about any challenges, or, you know, did anything in specific thematically emerge?
I think people working in small crews, I think, found it maybe more difficult to engage with the standards, or this sort of flexibility with the standards. They maybe thought, oh, well, there's only 5 of us. I have a self-shooter, and how are we going to meet these standards? So I think it's maybe that message that there is, they're not supposed to be something that you fail at. It's something that, everybody can engage with. We found that a little bit, but no, other than that, not really.
Could I add to that a little bit? Yeah, because obviously, in terms of what we've been using the standards for, we've done multiple pilots with BAFTA, with the British Independent Film Awards, and there is a big piece of it that is definitely about us doing education to let people know how it applies to them. So very much and very in the early days as well, got concerns from small crews, particularly very low budget documentaries, saying how do I go about doing this? So it's about making clear to people that, look, we're not expecting you to be able to do the same thing as sort of a big inward investment feature. It's about coming and engaging with it at the level that you're at. It's not saying you get a pass because you're small. It's like, you're small, what can you do within your budget, within your crew size? So the biggest thing I would say that when we've done pilots and the change over time from, giving people the education is people are more aware of how exactly it applies to them. And actually that made them sort of more eager to engage with it, saying like, I understand that you're sort of taking this project at its level. So here's all the things that we did.
Were there questions? I did see a hand over here somewhere. Maybe it's gone back down. Oh, it's back up again.
Hi, I'm Inge Sorensen from University of Glasgow. I think this is a wonderful initiative and totally much needed, but it's a kind of structural problem, really, isn't it? It's the same in my sector. We have hardly any representation from anything in the university sector. So I was just wondering whether you're also considering ways of kind of reaching back into early years, into ways of encouraging all groups to have careers in the media and the film and TV industry at an earlier stage, whether you are thinking of initiatives that might reach that way as well.
We absolutely are in Screen Scotland. Yeah, it's not my area of expertise, but yes, that's something that's been spoken about in under-actor review. To open up that career to people at a much earlier age, yeah, absolutely.
I would just point out that our head of film education over here, Fee Milligan and Daryl Robertson. So yeah.
Hello, I'm Fee Milligan Rennie. I'm the incoming head of education. Scott Donaldson leaves Screen Scotland at the end of March, and we'll be super happy to chat to you about that.
Unmasked there. Anything further from anyone? Okay, well, we're trying to close slightly early, but I'm sure any of us would be happy to chat to anyone individually if you want to grab us. But thank you all for listening, and thank you for your questions.
Thank you.